our guest speaker is David Carrier Acco, and he was kind enough to provide me with his bio, which is very extensive, but I'd like to highlight a couple of areas of David. First, David is a member of the Peter Ballantine Cree Nation in Saskatchewan. His educational background is extensive. He holds an MBA in international business, as well as graduate degrees in marketing, e-commerce, and business analysis. David, being a very enterprising individual, parlayed all of this education into creating his own company called Acco in 2006, and has been a thriving going concern. It is considered to be the premier Indigenous-led consulting firm specializing in facilitating constructive and respectful Indigenous engagement on behalf of governments, corporate clients, and NGOs. David works with Indigenous communities and organizations right across Canada, garnering extensive experience in the design, implementation, and facilitation of successful Indigenous engagement initiatives. It was in 2008, David and his wife did something of tremendous significance. They established and created the Indigenous Internship Program, which provides the opportunity for Indigenous people to work and to be mentored on their clients' projects. The program has been very successful to create opportunity for Indigenous people, but equally important, to bring greater workplace diversity. David, since 2015, has been a board member of Native Montreal, which is a friendship center in the city. It serves Indigenous families, individuals, and the community in the greater Montreal area. David has a passion, and that is combining the use of technology with Indigenous traditional knowledge to develop environmental protection and climate adaptation solutions for all of Canada. And he continues his work to build Indigenous capacity in this particular area. Oh, did I mention as well that David is also a proud member of the Canadian Armed Forces? He is an officer in the Air Cadet program that promotes the development and Canada's youth and interest in the aviation and aerospace. And so it gives me great pleasure, and it is our honor, that David is going to address us on a topic entitled The Path Towards Reconciliation, Understanding the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's Call to Action. David, I turn it to you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And I'm always shy when I hear my background because I try to keep everything as low key as possible, you know. But that's just me, you know. So thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Carmen, Anna, and everybody here for the invitation to be able to speak to you about something that has been quite a journey for me, from being recognized as a very tall Filipino to being really becoming Indigenous, and we call that a sort of, in our world, a red journey. And also take a moment to thank the elder for his wonderful words to bring us to our thoughts, and also to remind us that we all are accountable to a higher power, you know, at the end of the day, and will be called to account for our work. So what we choose to do in this lifetime really impacts, you know, generations to come. So as we start thinking about the seventh generations, and that's really a guiding principle for everything that I'm trying to do here with the time that I'm given, which I don't know how long it is. So not to be macabre or anything like that, but just really realizing that I only have a finite amount of time to really do what I got to do. So I try to jam pack everything. With that being said, okay, I'm going to make you guys drink through a fire hose and trying to give you kind of perspective of about Indigenous relations and experience within Canada, but also kind of leave you a way forward with some thoughts with the time that you have. You know, so having said that, I just want to share my screen because that's going to keep me together. Here we go. I think this should do it. You should, and I just want to see all your wonderful faces here as I oh, I thought I froze. Okay. While this thing got together. Okay. And I'm just going to blow this up so that I can see all you. Wonderful. Okay. Do you all see my screen?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. Yes. Okay, great. So I was really honored the fact that to be able to speak to you to the McGill's Life Learning the group, and as Carmen Turan said, I've been influenced also by the fact that we are all on a journey, and it is incumbent for us to absorb as much as we possibly can with the time we're given. And so when McGill, the MCLL basically said, hey, listen, we really want you to kind of just not only just, get to know the history and the diversity, but we want to honor it, and really be, and really integrate it into, our constituency. So, and viewing it as a great opportunity to learn and educate and going with the ongoing issues, and also give us a bit of context to understand this, and just to make sure that we can get through that reconciliation process with what we have, so I think this is a great opportunity for me to kind of expunge my knowledge a little bit to another group of people, which I'm really, really happy to do. So we did through land acknowledgement, which is an important. I want to give you a context of what the land acknowledgement is, and if you'll see how it permeates right now and where we are in today. And land acknowledgement, I heard two arguments about land acknowledgement. One is Indigenous people did not give a land acknowledgement to each other. We sort of, and then another viewpoint where Indigenous people sort of recognize the fact that they're coming into another person's territory and they have to, and ask for permission to come through the territory, whether you're hunting or traveling through what I wanted to zero in on the fact that a land acknowledgement is not among Indigenous people, it's among all people. And it's sort of a recognition that you exist, and you have a way of life, and you have a government and people within your particular territory. Africans kind of saw it, and something really interesting I heard is that when they have a greeting, they come and say, I see you, you see me, so that recognition. And when you change that, what a land acknowledgement does is change that dialogue. And as you can see, the Montreal Canadiens now have a land acknowledgement before every game. And this is a very important step, because this is where, they as a hockey club are recognizing the fact that they're playing and on their traditional territory where lacrosse used to be played, so just to give you that perspective. And also I want to take a moment to think about McGill and moving that Hochelaga rock out of obscurity and really making it prominent within the university grounds. So those are the kind of things that the land acknowledgement means for Indigenous people. The fact that you acknowledge that I am here, and what does that mean in its entirety? But it wasn't always like this. So I just want to leave you, so as I take you through this journey of how we got to this point. So what I want to talk a little bit about, and I'll try to do this really quickly, is the fact I want to get, dispel the terminology, because that's a lot of questions I've asked. The other question I get asked a lot is, what's the historical context? Like, how did we get from, to here? What happened in the past? And also, people ask me is a lot of questions, which has been impacted me a little bit. And I'll tell you a little bit about my journey, because it didn't start off. We call that in a very colloquial term among Indigenous people, we call it a red journey. You know, that's when Indigenous people sort of rediscover themselves, you know, or rediscover their heritage. So those modern day events, I'll talk a little bit about that. And also, I want to leave you with some homework. You know, so this we're like, you know, what's without learning with it? It's a little bit of homework, and then we'll open the floor for just some discussion. So common things that people ask me about. Well, they ask me, common things that people ask me about is the terminology. What's the proper thing to say? And I say, well, is it an Indian? Is it Indigenous, or so on and so forth? So I kind of give them a little bit of the, you know, the origin of the words. So Indian, yes, we are called Indians, okay? This is a name that kind of stuck because Columbus got lost, okay? He was on his way to India. He kind of tripped across North America. He said, I must have hit India, you know? And ever since that kind of stuck for about 500 years. Then people started rethinking it. I think there's a whole movement of being politically correct and say, oh, we should use native. But that kind of confused the fact that, you know, pointing it out that some people that have been living here for generations, they sort of defer themselves as native Canadians or you know, Canadians, Italians, but they're sort of like they were born here. So that kind of confused the word as well. And of course, the word Aboriginal started to come in and Aboriginal rights and so on and so forth. But generally speaking, it was also confused. If you talk to an American, they'll say, are you from Australia? You know, are you an Aborigine? You know, so that was not the terminology, but the word Indigenous seems to be permeating, you know, globally. And what it is it belongs to here. You cannot find another Mohawk person or Cree person, you know, in Europe. You know, they're not Indigenous to Europe. They're Indigenous to Canada. You know, so it made more sense to look at it, unless this person was traveling or living for work as a Cree person, like once upon a time I did. You know, living in Germany. So I was a transplant, you know, in many ways. I was an immigrant on that side. But in Canada, I'm Indigenous. So from the other thing, the construct that you're going to see as we go through this is the word reserve and a reserve land. And I'll go a little bit further into that. But really what we're talking about communities, you know, communities of people within a particular area. And of course, the word band, in other words, that's another Indian Act construct. But when they start talking about that, it's we mean band as a First Nations. So you don't have Inuit bands or Métis bands, you have First Nations bands. And what we're talking about here is a council. It's a way of system of government when we think about it. So those are the three basic questions people ask, but there's a lot more in there. So that we, you know, I can spend a whole course talking about for the next semester. So who are Indigenous people? Well, let's take it from the Canadian Constitution, you know, view. So the Canadian Constitution recognizes three basic groups. So they're the Inuit, the Métis, you know, and First Nations. So those are the ones you'll hear about. But those, when you conglomerate along the lines, those are really what Indigenous people, they're the first peoples of Canada. You know, when we talk about them with Indigenous roots. So Indigenous people, this is a 2016, you know, view. You know, it's very hard to get census data from the Indigenous community for various reasons. A lot of times, we do not want to be counted by the government. We don't want to be recognized by the government. Because you know, because we had our own system of government. But generally speaking, this is a census that came out that 4.9% of the population, you know, is Indigenous. There's 52 languages. There's 52 nations, about 650 communities. And this number is changing because as more people, as I mentioned to you a bit earlier, are on a red journey and rediscovering. And I'll give you a perspective on that is when I first started off, I just got my status little less than a year, and it was a 20-year fight. So I've moved from being a Métis, recognized Métis, to reestablishing my First Nations roots, you know, which changed, you know, the demographics. People are going through the same kind of journey. But generally speaking, that's when we look at the 4.9, and that number is also increasing. So when you call them First Nations are governed by the Indian Act, which I'll get onto a little bit later on. But generally speaking, under the Indian Act, there's about 618 different nations, about 630 communities, about 50 different languages, and about 50 different nations within it. So when you look at Australia or New Zealand, there's like 7 or 8 or 3 or 4. In Canada, it's very complex. There's, when you look at it from a First Peoples point of view. And the thing about it is, I'm not even talking about the derivatives of the language. So if you talk like the Jane's Bakery, the language, you'll see them, they can turn around and tell somebody who's from a Chisasibi versus Waswanipi and so on and so forth, just by the language or the accents and so on and so forth. So even the derivative of languages are changing, are different. And generally speaking, on the consensus of 2016, there's about 900,000 plus, and that number keeps on changing as people, as the legislation changes and more people become part of that membership where they were excluded in the past. So when we talk about the Inuit people, okay, Inuit and the Nuktatuk, you don't say the Inuit, it's like Inuit, okay, and basically means people. And this is where we got the Inuit. And there are 53 communities in different regions in the Nunavut, region, and I'm not going to butcher their names. I apologize. My dyslexia clicks in and I butcher people's names. And so, but generally speaking, there's these particular 5 regions that within the Inuit territory. Sorry, I just did it. The Inuit territory, and there's about 64,000 Inuit living in Canada. But again, this is old statistics. As people start rediscovering, this number keeps on increasing. The Métis people, they basically, this is if people have read Susan Moody before, Roughing It in a Bush. This is where Susan Moody defines the new Canadian, and what she calls it a mixing of the both old and the new world. And from there, it's a mix between the First Nations community and with European heritage. And this was basically, which I'll go a little bit further into, but based on commerce. That we had a matriarchal society, which means that women own title of the land and access to the territory. So what the Europeans did through marriage, they kind of made European men marry Indigenous women so they can have access to those hunting grounds where they can bring the pelts and to the different trading posts. In there, they formed their own language, their own culture, which is sort of taking the best of the both worlds. And I would say this is where they start to indigenize Europeans. Okay, so and I'll go into that a little bit further, what that really means. But so just giving you a preview. But most important thing is with the Métis is when you look at the Red River area, these are the ones that the government really recognizes: Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, around that area, parts of Ontario. And why they're so dispersed is because after the rebellion, a lot of the Métis people actually had to run away as they were trying to escape, and they went and hid in their families on reserve, that might be in Ontario or where they had familiar ties. So that's where you see the dispersion of it. But in Quebec, most important thing, you see, well, I'm Métis, which means, like a mixed blood, which holds true, but there's no recognition of Métis people in Quebec. So really, when you look at it, it's along those ones who can tie themselves to the Red River communities and belong to that registry. So, well, let's talk a little bit about history here. So I'm not going to do it justice, but I'm going to give you what I call a little soupçon of when you think about the Indigenous people. I will turn around and say, we've been here for a very, very, very long time. Okay, so there's many theories about how we're here. The most accepted one is the Beringia Bridge. which is basically when you look at Alaska coming across during the last ice age, it was a lowland called Beringia, which is a grassland, and you just follow the migration of animals, hunting, gathering society. And so by tracking them, they basically ended up in North America. Now, what's interesting is the ice age, the climate change, we're starting to figure this out, right? There was opening the ice sheet opened and closed over certain times, but at one point in time, there was a corridor that was available that kind of allowed Indigenous people, that were the first Indigenous people to cross over. Now, there's a couple of other theories I'm going to talk a little bit about, but they're very controversial. You've heard of the ones that we came across from Polynesia and everything else, and populated, basically South America. Very controversial, that kind of thing. And there's, you hear another theory that we came across from Europe through ice bridges and so on and so forth that were supported by Huron and Wendake people when they say, no, we got European ancestry because we came across from the European side. Those are two very, very controversial theories. And the thing about it is now that you're doing DNA testing or DNA find, and one of the things we talk about is the Anzac child. And that's where they've turned around and they find where they're saying, okay, well, they can trace a lot of it along the Beringia side. So, but again, what my point being is that there, not many people have really asked this question. And I'm going to put a bug in your ear. I'm going to talk a little bit about terra nullius, okay? So the doctrine of discovery. But a lot of it, because of that, there's not a lot of work being done on it. And now there's starting to be work that are being done around trying to understand migration theories about Indigenous people's origins. Now, if you talk to the Iroquois will say, we were always here. We're children born from this land, and we did not migrate. So those are the really things to think about. But I want you to hang on, not to the migration theory, but what was here. There were well-organized societies. We had trade. We had a system of government. And to give you a perspective on that, when Thomas Jefferson was looking for a new model for a system of government, he turned to the Iroquois Confederacy of the balance of power. They had managed to keep a balance of power in the lower St. Lawrence area based on 7 tribes. So he borrowed the same model. He created a judiciary. He created a legislative branch, and he created an executive branch to run the government that had all equal balance of power. They had to come to consensus. Thomas Jefferson looked at this and said, I can use this, okay? So again, there's a sort of indigenization going on of a way of thinking. So I want to take you to take a look at it from that lens when we go through this story. So let's talk a little about a first contact. There's a lot of stuff happening in between. So for those who want to encourage people to write papers on this stuff, I highly encourage you to talk to future grad students and say, hey, I got a great idea for a paper for you. So, so there you go. So first contact. So first contact about the 11th century, but even first contact when we look at the Vikings and so on and so forth, there's probably a lot earlier. But the normal one, they besides the Vikings, and the one that people really zero in is 1492. Columbus sails the ocean blue, and finds himself where he thinks he's in India. But the most important thing of that came out of that is that he just didn't do it once. He was going back and forth, and he was trying to establish colonies and so on and so forth, and looking for El Dorado or gold for the Spanish. Jacques Cartier comes across, and then Champlain. But this is where the beginning of the Franco-Indigenous alliances were. And then, of course, the fur trade starts it's a fashion industry, that kind of thing, where there's plenty of furs, and being able to bring back, this material back that had, value, at least from the European perspective. But of course, what happens is that with trade comes competition. So the French and English start to come across, and they start trying to establish their relations and try to fight for market at that point in time. And this brings sort of a war. This brings war to Canada in a way. And just a little note about that, about those friends. There you start seeing alliances between the French and the English, between the French and Indigenous people, and also English and French, English and Indigenous people. So I just want to back up a little bit. This is where you start looking at Metis, who are aligned with French colony or France, and this is where they speak Metis and French. Or when you speak Mohawk, Mohawk and English. So you can really trace it back to that relationship because they needed Indigenous people to as allies to fight wars between each other. So first conflicts, Taylor knows, I was going to tell you about this, is doctrine of discovery. So generally speaking, it's a doctrine that's used and saying basically, you know what? No one's here. It's empty land, and basically, because it's you established this European colony and so on and so forth. Now it's yours. So in a nutshell, that's the simplest explanation. It's new land to belongs to you, and you can claim it for the crown. So hence one of the things, and we talked a little bit about. If you have an argument of saying that no one was here, so you will not put much research in or understanding about who was here before, because it kind of undermines this doctrine of terra nullius. But also what happens is the Franco-Iroquois wars. And we're talking about alliances and so on and so forth. So we have these wars that are going on between fighting over territory and who has access to territory. But now we start seeing the establishment, because they start building forts, posts to supply for First Nations to supply the armies and the new settlements, and to become trading partners. And these trading posts and these forts and so on start basically building the network for colonization. And one of the things that happened at that point was the first treaties between the British and the Iroquois people were being formed. And that is an important thing because you hang on to this, and I'm going to go back a little bit to nation relationship. And this is the fundamentals, okay? When we have treaties are based on nations, okay? So there's this recognition of Indigenous people or First People being a nation, a country of its own. War is very expensive, so at the very end of the day, and we're seeing it being played out, how draining it could be on an economy, how draining it could be, on people. So they decide, well, you know what? Let's, basically get to a great peace where we can have, trade and prosperity and so on and so forth. So they had the Great Peace, which is actually just up the road here from where I am in Montreal, in 1701. So how did we go from, having an established government and, having trading partners and this nation-to-nation relationship? And this is where I'll kind of take you a little bit on this journey. So what happens about 1763 to about 1862, Indian affairs belonged to the army. Now hang on to that, okay? Because this is where you're going to pull a little string through this. Okay, and it was based on the Hudson Bay Company. So you have lobbyists and so on and so forth, but it's basically, you had a corporation that was looking at access to territory and trying to figure out ways, to control the territory. So, but Indian affairs, where it was belongs to the army, and with the Indigenous people. What we also see during that time is the first secessions of land and creations of the word reserve. Okay, so hence the first part of what we're talking about. So what it is basically tracts of land that were, pushing Indigenous people off the land that was either fertile or part of the, accessible to, trade, or accessible that generally speaking, that the Indigenous people were in the way. So they basically moved them off to an area and reserved some land for them to live and to hunt and to do whatever they do, right, at that particular point in time. So this is where we have the first, and I'm kind of like, I'm giving it a lot of justice, but trying to just give a concept around that. So, but generally speaking, that's what it is. It's reserved for Indigenous people. And then we have the beginning of assimilation policies, and politics that go along with that. And this is where we start seeing those first lines of colonization. In there's a whole dissertation, of course, that could be written about colonization in Canada on how do we get to that point. Then we have assimilation policies. This is the broad strokes again of the policy. So we have number treaties. And number treaties are basically, within the government or the crown negotiated, with different communities, and when you look at number treaties, Treaty 1, Treaty 2, Treaty 3, and then, and you see them you can actually see them as you follow the railroad, as Canada's building its railroad from east to west. And they were ordered, they were basically, when they did a treaty, they basically numbered them chronologically. So it could start off in the east and then end up in the west for Treaty 2 or Treaty 3 and so on and so forth. So they basically were in that chronological order. When you look at it, the term Indians became part of into federal jurisdiction. They left Hudson Bay from the commercial side to becoming part of the government. And of course, the Indian Act starts to take place, starts to take form. And this is the establishment of residential schools. So what's the two pillars of the Indian Act? Well, fundamentally, this is what it does. It basically gives you control over who's an Indian, and basically puts them on a registry. And the whole point of the matter is you construct it in such a way that the Indian Act turns around and starts limiting the amount of membership that you have. So basically what they have is they say, okay, well, if you're C1 or C2, and I'll give you the basics on this one. Okay, so if you're C1, that kind of thing, you can pass down your status. So two C1s marrying, they can pass down their status to the grandchildren. If you married, C1 and a C2, you can pass down, your children become C1 and they can pass down their status. But if you married C2, and C2 meant you cannot pass down your status. But if you married two C2s equal to C1, then we can pass down status. But if you're a C2 and you married a non-Indigenous person, you can't pass down status anymore. So what they tried to do is encourage as much as much marrying a non-Indigenous people. That was one thing. So if a non-Indigenous woman married an Indigenous man, she gained status. But if an Indigenous woman married a non-Indigenous man, she lost status. And of course, they lost status if you joined the war and and everything else like that. They had other things penciled out. So they would show up on the registry during, when Indigenous people were hunting and they counted everybody and you ended up on a registry and then you ended up off a registry because you came up after the Indian agent showed up. So you were penciled out. So this is the way they kind of controlled it. The other way they had is the absolute control of governance. So they had to create that system of governance. They took away their government, which was working this balance of power, the Confederacy, and they replaced it with their own way of government. So the band government says you're going to order band council and so on and so forth. You're going to come and elect a new chief every 2 years and so on and so forth, which is still existing today. So just imagine, okay, a government mandate for the parliament is 4 years, provincial is 4 years, but for Indigenous community, it's just 2 years, So how can you be effective within those particular 2 years? So that was that absolute control and absolute power. Those are the two pillars of the Indian Act. Now this nice fellow here, Dr. Campbell Scott, okay, who is a celebrated bureaucrat, famous poet and writer and everything else like that. Not only he basically said it very succinctly. He said, well, our objective is to continue until there's no single Indian in Canada. And if they've been absorbed, they've been assimilated either through death or through, through renouncing their Indigenous heritage and living into the cities and so on and so forth. And there will not be an Indigenous question or an Indian question. Okay. And the thing about it, when you make it an Indian a question or anything a question or a problem, okay, it's something to be solved, okay? And history is marked with questions or problems. We had the Jewish question. We had the Black problem, okay? We had the Jewish problem, and so on and so forth. So we were labeled a problem to be solved, okay? And so when you look at that from that lens, you can figure out how people can do what they do, because they're trying to solve a problem. Food for thought. So let's talk a little bit about residential schools. So residential schools were mandatory. They had a function of splitting up families and removing children from their communities with one purpose. We want to lose their culture, want to make sure they lose their language and familial ties. In there, of course, documented sexual and physical abuse. And of course, what this causes intergenerational trauma. Now, I'm going to give you a little story about this. Okay, my mother, she went to, I think it was Indian day school. I just found out recently. But she turned around, she said to me, David, I want to be rest assured during the residential school, the Truth and Reconciliation. She goes, I just want to tell you, I was never abused. The nuns were very close, very nice to me and everything else like that. So I wasn't affected by residential schools or Indian day school. And I turned around, I said to my Mom, I don't speak Cree. Let's cause her pause for a second, So I said, even though I said, I was successful, but when you look at it from that, they were very successful because I don't speak Cree. And the other thing, which I'll hang on to, I'll tell you a little bit about, but I'm on this side of the country where I come from, Saskatchewan. So just hang on to that for a little bit. When you look at it from the residential school side of it, and this is the topic, there's about 150,000 Indigenous children that went through the residential school system, and these are the records. They only looked at a third of the records, okay? They found that there was a 4,200 unnamed, death records in the Indigenous community. And someone around told me something very significant about residential schools when I was chatting with him. He said to me, when you went to a residential school, you lost not only your name, but you lost your birthday. We don't even know when our birthday was, And my Julie, my wife, when she talks about her dad did not know her birthday. He thought he was born a week, a certain day. And then what happened when they applied for their status and they finally found that they got the records, they finally got his birthday and he was 2 weeks off. So just to give you a perspective on that loss. So they didn't even celebrate birthdays. So when you look at it from that, is that a lot of this is unknown. It's under sealed records, to this day. Now we're finding, of course, the children and so on, where there are no records, either destroyed or hidden or in some sort of archive that people don't want to talk about. So just to give you perspective of what is it like to be in a residential school at the time. So the odds of dying in a war in World War II was 1 out of 26. So just imagine yourself in a platoon or in a flight, or, if you're in the Air Force or whatever, and that one of you, when I look around, is going to die, get wounded, or or whatever situation might be. Now, just imagine yourself in a classroom of 25 students or 30 students, and you're realizing, well, you know what? One of us will die, and especially if you're younger, the chances are higher that you're going to die of something: tuberculosis, abuse, murder, So when you think about it from that, and you talk about trauma, you got a bunch of kids that are living like soldiers when you think about it. And that's the impact of when I make that case of intergenerational trauma. Now they turn around and say that trauma actually changes your DNA, which causes you to have more susceptible to depression and addictions and so on and so forth. And this is studies that are coming out today about the impacts of trauma. Now, I want to leave you with a little bit of a thought of somebody who seeks truth to power. So let me tell you a little bit about Peter Henderson Bryce, Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce. So Bryce becomes the first, chief medical officer for Department of Interior, which is Indian Affairs at the time. And he's responsible for the health of, Indigenous children in schools. So he puts together a report, he turns around and he says, hey, ventilation and so on and so forth, we got to improve this, because this is really the primary cause of deaths in the schools. And what Bryce recommends, and it makes a bunch of recommendations, he passes it over to that nice fellow, Duncan Campbell Scott, who turns around, who's the head of Indian Affairs at the time, and says, no, too expensive. No, not worth it. No, not in the public interest. No. Not in the government's interest, okay? So eventually what happens is he terminates Bryce's funding for research. We've seen this playbook before, from previous governments where they do not believe in research anymore, So this is just a real playbook within the way to do things. So you stop doing research And eventually what they do is they stop funding him from speaking, so that kind of thing. So they go, no, we don't want you to speak at any academic conferences anymore, so forth. No, let them get the word out. So it begins to suppress this, and it's systematic when you think about it, when you look at it. So what Bryce does, he starts speaking truth to power. He creates the national crime book, and it was sold for, I think it was 35 cents or something like that, to try to bring it to the general public. And not only that, but he warns this kind of, and he turns around and he talks to the minister at the time, Frank Oliver, and he says, you know what, you keep walking down this road, you're going to end up on the wrong side of history. The government's I'm trying to help you not end up on the wrong side of history. And he's also turned out and saying, at the very end of the day, I am not going to stand on the wrong side of history either. So I'm not going to be associated with this. Some people interpret it as something he's trying to wash his hands of it. I kind of ruined. I read it. I looked at it as a way of him trying to say, you know what, you guys can stand there, but I don't want to stand here. That kind of thing. So he's warning people. But what he's saying, also turn around and saying something, and this really deals with the non-Indigenous community through the generations. He's relying on public apathy. So he's talking about indifference and, basically, ignorance and so on and so forth. This is what I'm going to rely on. The government's going to rely on really to deal with the Indian problem, or the Indian question. And really, at the end of the day, it's phenomenally correct. Okay, and this is when we look at it from that lens, And what the thing about it is, what he also turns on and says, this is a product of inaction, and that kind of thing, and managing the status quo, because that's what the Indian Act is supposed to do. It's supposed to manage the status quo at the very end of the day. That's the whole act. No new membership, no new funding, no new land, no new, that kind of thing. And eventually you're going to all be assimilated. Now, I found John A. McDonald's Twitter account, okay, in my look, okay, and things like that. And, people in this day and age really turn around and say, you know what, words really matter. And at the end of the day, they really do. And I'm going to make a connection for you. Okay, so he turns around and says, Johnny McDonald, and stands up in Parliament and everything else like that. And he talks and he's got his up there and he's going to turn around and say all these wonderful things. And he's going to say, oh, we're doing all they can. He's talking about the administrating Indian, refusing food to Indians on the verge of starvation, to reduce expense. I'm doing a good thing for Canada. I'm reducing expense, So he also turns around and says, the child that lives with savage parents, and surrounds themselves with savages, when you look at the Indian, residential schools, what are you going to create? If they live in the same city, we have to remove them. We're going to create, really articulated savages, at the very end of the day. They're still savages, So when you look at it, it just says, oh, let's talk about potlatch. Now this is permeated through our thing because we have our potluck dinners, right? He says, you know what? This is a misdemeanor. It's a debauchery. It's something against us, against all our Christian our Christian belief. So we have to put it into law, Just for a fun fact, I would like you all as homework to go to Google the ghost dance, And it's still on the books today as a misdemeanor. You cannot, do in the United States, do the ghost dance, So the other thing is, we must vindicate. The white man is the person in power. We ought to teach the Indigenous people or the red man that the law is the law and we have control over the law, So a savage is a savage, until he ceases being a savage. And if we don't deal with the savage, we're going to go to war and we're going to do all these, things. And we're in danger, by the savage. And of course, let's convince, the red man that the white man governs. Words matter at the very end of the day. Words matter because this is what the produces. Systemic racism. Okay? When you think about it. It also permeates what happens at the very top also permeates all of Canadian society when they view us Indigenous people. Wealth and income disparities, criminal justice, throw them all in jail. It's the way they belong. Employment and education. They can get a good education if they come to Montreal or Toronto or so on and so forth. Or they just go off to Brantford to get a good education. Winnipeg. Get a good education in Winnipeg. Housing. Healthcare. When you look at it. Political power. This is what words does and a generation. When you think about it. This is a whole course on its own, so I will, but when you look at it and you look at it from, and I don't have to push the needle very far to put it in today's context. Just look at Donald Trump's Twitter account. When you think about it, as much as times have changed, times have not changed. Ooh, so I don't want to depress you, overly. I want to give you a ray of hope. So how do we go from, having this wonderful system of governing, nation to nation to the point where we get to systemic racism, okay? And remember, there's no systemic racism in Quebec, okay? Okay, there's racism in Quebec, but there's no systemic racism in Quebec, okay? Because it comes from the top down, okay? So I'll leave you with that, okay? And who said that? Okay, so, how do we get to the point we are today? And this is a little bit about my journey, okay? So I want to zero in on the 60s scoop. So I was born in Winnipeg, okay? And my mother, the 60s scoop was basically, as the residential school was winding down and taking children away, they started to use the social system. Okay, so when I was born, my father had lost his job. He's from Trinidad and Tobago. And my father lost his job, and my mother was already a poor Indian woman, with two other children, and I'm the third, the middle child. That kind. And the nurses were walking around to each one of the and this is my mother telling this story, and I just found it a couple of years ago, to each one of the Indigenous women who just had children. Do you want to give up your children for adoption? Do you want to give up your children for adoption? So she knew what was going on. So what happened was, she just realized that at the state she's going to lose her children. So when they got me home, my parents basically ran away. They ran away to Trinidad and Tobago, where I spent the first 4 years of my life. So I was born in Winnipeg, and literally about a month later, I'm being baptized in Trinidad. So I didn't, how fast my parents must have got out of town. And what they did was, when they decided to come back to Canada, they came to live in this particular area. They did not go back where my parents are, where my grandmother was in Cumberland House in Saskatchewan, or where her entire family was in Manitoba. They literally ran away onto this side. They stayed away and haven't been there. So this is how I ended up here. So fast forward, my uncle is the Lieutenant Governor of Saskatchewan, and so on and so forth. So times have been changing, but nonetheless, when I look at it in terms of displacement, could you imagine the opportunity I have there with the family connections, but to have to reestablish myself as an Indigenous person here? The other things so this is how I ended up. So 60 scoop is still permeating. So you're looking at the net effect right in front of you. So the other side of the coin is the Calder case. And this is where it kind of acknowledges Indigenous rights. So people are fought for this, and it's basically, saying that they had title, before colonization, and this cannot be extinguished. So this is the Supreme Court. The other one is the recognition of Aboriginal or Indigenous rights, and they built it into the Constitution in 1982. And this was recognized and confirmed by Canada. So those are three things that are happening. And the big takeaway is we're starting to fight for, trying to unwind and get recognition. Now, here's a little bit of my story. So I'm in the Canadian Armed Forces. I'm very happy as being, labeled as a tall Filipino, kind of hiding in plain sight kind of thing, and I'm fueling up helicopters. This is how I'm putting myself through school. I'm getting an aircraft in the Canadian Armed Forces. And the Acco crisis hits. Now, the thing about being a reservist is you kind of work at home, you have a day job, and you kind of where you have a weekend warrior. That's what they call it. So when the Acco crisis and Chateauguay was shut down, and Acco was shut, and it was very hard to travel around Montreal, very hard to move gifts, goods and services around, I was facing a lot of criticism and heat. because of that. And I was hearing it around the water cooler. And of course, the racists, I became an apologist. I was explaining land claims and so on and so forth. And then that was my rude awakening to my Indigenous journey, as I put it, as the red journey. But what came out of the Oka crisis was the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. That's the first time Canada had to look at itself introspectively. And what was interesting about the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People is the first time the Canadian government asked Aboriginal people about Aboriginal people. And we came up with this voluminous, view of looking at land and water and education and all these things that were, Canada had constructed, and and was that Indigenous, the net effect that was impacting Indigenous people. And out of that came, a lot of recommendations. One of them became the procurement strategy for Aboriginal business. Government started wanting to do business with Indigenous people. Let's start with the economic reconciliation. And also other things are making Indigenous people proud. So National Indigenous Day came out of that report. Also, more significantly, last residential school closed, 1996, when you think about it. 1996 is one of the last ones. So it's happened in our lifetime, but also led to the formal apology, and of course, there's the UNDRIP, the UN Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. You should read that document. But also the adopting the UNDRIP. So one of the things that came also out of that is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the Murder and Missing Women's inquiry. So those are things that came out of that. But also the release of the report was significant, where, they talk about the human rights violations. I could add things of Cindy Blackstock with, the child first, Jordan's principles. There's a lot of stuff here, but the significance. But also wanted to point out Joyce Ashikan's death. As much as we made this progress, we have this tendency to slip back. And you look at it, and the public servants that are working in Joliet and so on and so forth, and those who, just to recap, Joyce Ashikan, so we're on the same page, she was dying on a gurney, and she had multiple children, and what I understand, the gallbladder is a very big risk for women who had multiple children when they're pregnant, and probably her gallbladder exploded or something towards that effect, and she was being poisoned. But they looked at her, she's a drunk Indian, only good for having babies, and everything else like that. So that's how, and she had to film herself dying in order to get some recognition. If she didn't do that, we would not know, and no one would care, at least in that hospital, when you think about it. And then there's the Vance Commission and a whole bunch of other things that are looking at the way public servants work. And of course, I cannot escape the fact that now we're finding children. The legacy. Now, I want you to hang on to something a little bit as we go into this, is that we believe in a 7-generation principle. And 7 generations means that what we do today affects 7 generations in the future, 150 years. So what government did 150 years ago is now we're feeling the impacts of it. This is where we are today. This is why it's important when we think about it and we indigenize ourselves, when we start thinking about the way we do things. This is the net effect we're finding. And this story is not over. We're going to find more bodies. We talked about the Ross Pavilion. There was a big controversy just around, just in our own backyard here in McGill, And at the end of the day, we're not finished the story because no one is done looking at trying to identify these children. When you start trying to identify these children, you can imagine the emotional impact. Now, I'm going to give you degrees of separation here. When the first children were found in Kamloops, I called my chief friends in Kamloops, and I'm not abashed to admit it, we wept, because he had family buried there. So the degrees of separation for Indigenous people along these lines is 0. Now, I'm going to leave you with something. Now, for the Canadian experience, it's 0. Because you know me, now you know somebody who knows somebody. So those degrees of separation, even to this day, when you think about it. And this is why it's such an abomination on Canada, in terms of what we have to deal with that was constructed 150 years ago. So having said that, I don't want to, so we gone through this. Now we're at this point where we're saying, okay, you guys had to fight for it. Okay, I recognize that. So I want to join you in the battle. I want to join you in how to, how to affect real change, And someone turned around and said, you can affect real change even at 100 years old, that's what turnaround's around. You can pray for reconciliation, in the terms of that, or make reconciliation infectious, So how would we do that? And, and that's a real personal journey. But one of the suggestions I have is start thinking about what can I be, how can I move from colonization to indigenization? And what the hell does that mean? Okay. So we look at colonization, let's call it the way it is, right? You take control over people, you take control over the values, you take control over the religion, the laws, their policies, and you favor for you, at the very end of the day, okay, over Indigenous people. So it's absolute control. So I proved out there's colonization, so, okay. Well, then we look at it from an Indigenous perspective. We want to decolonize, and we want to regain our Indigenous worldviews, and we want to establish that. We want to do away with Western, views. I want to wear my bolo. I want to wear my Thunderbird. This is, by the way, my grandmother gave to me about 30 years ago, 30, 40 years ago, God rest her soul. So it's a cherished thing. I want to wear my Thunderbird. I want to be, and that is my tie. We also want to take on Western interpretations. We want to get back to the way we see things, second generation principles. Now, what happens when you get indigenization? So we have one side where Canada is going through reconciliation right now. They're trying to figure that out, what that means, to reestablish that relationship. Indigenous people going through resurgence, it's decolonization. Where the two meet is what we call indigenization, okay? And this is where we kind of look at it from, incorporating worldviews in ourselves. Thomas Jefferson did it when he started to look at it in establishing a government. He took an Indigenous way of thinking, We also turn around and look at it. And one of the things I advocate, when I talk to government, I think you guys think in 4-year mandates. Indigenous people, Maori people, we think in 150 years from now. What is the net effect of that? You guys got to start thinking, imagining yourself Canada 150 years, not at the next election, which is 4 years. And don't make me try to think about my communities in 2-year principles, at the very end of the day. And we identify those opportunities for indigeneity. And this is one of the things that I'm going to give a shout out to McGill, okay, of what they're doing. It's what the New Vic project, when they looked at it and turned around and said, how would I bring physical representation into, a building, into a faculty? How do I do that? And now with the shout out with the project I'm working on with the law faculty, which is going to come out before the New Vic project, because they're looking at indigenization. And I turn around, I look at it, I say, you know what? That's very brave of you as an institution. Kudos, for thinking along those ways. So I'm thinking to myself, like, how do I get people to think of indigenization, the uniqueness of Canada, that we have, what we possess, and the degrees of separation. And I tell politicians, which is really interesting, I say this to them, much of the chagrin, I say, you know what? Canada is still a colonial experiment. When is Canada going to stop being a colonial experiment and start being a real nation and have nation-to-nation relationships and reestablish it? Can you imagine if Canada did that? As, we talk about two-state solutions and so on and so forth. Can we be the model for that? That means we're going to have to start thinking about our indigeneity and how it fits in within the fabric of Canada. It's not an us and them. That's what we worked as a collective before first contact. So when you think about that, so what can you do? One of the first things you could do is recognize National Indigenous Day, People's Day. We have wonderful ceremonies and wonderful things that happen. We have the urban powwows at McGill grounds. And this is where we can actually share that Canadian experience, that unique Canadian experience. The other thing I encourage people to do, and this is actually, I got a little misty when I looked at this, and I was collecting different pictures, and I was looking at, Orange Shirt Day. And Orange Shirt Day is one of the big catalysts of, to looking at an educational institution and so on and so forth. I say this is the big statement of protest that people done, and it's being done in corporations and what's in schools with non-Indigenous people and Indigenous people. And one of the ones that really struck me as I was looking at this is Run for Reconciliation. Show up July 1st. Someone actually wrote this. Just show up. Hashtag just show up. And as a call to action. And they just ran, apparently, just for the neighborhood. And it was a bunch of kids that did that. So this whole Every Child Matters is a real expression of being able to literally show your colors, wear your feelings on your sleeves. Other things you can get involved, look for ways of expanding your knowledge. Kudos, we've done this today. So also, find out who the Indigenous people are in your neighborhood. Join the Native Friendship Center. Join the, Native Montreal. And that's what Native Friendship Centers stand for. They're actually the mixing between the two worlds that Susan Moody talked about, and the interaction. There's this wonderful scene I've seen on The Immigrants where this Indigenous women show up, and it's an old movie actually, which they show up to this first settler, and she's scared at first, but she offers them food, and everything else, and then they just have this quiet interaction between women. And then they move off along the ways. And the next day, she shows up and there's this big piece of venison sitting outside her door. That is a Native Friendship Center, so to give you that view. Learn about the land acknowledgement in your area. Participate. That's the other side to those events, and it doesn't take much. And organize events. Fundraising events. And this is one of the things that I've been doing, I've been asked to do with the diocese, believe it. I'm a C+ Catholic. But one of the things I've been doing is running around, going to different speeches. And every time they ask for giving me an honorarium, I basically say, hey, give it to the Native Friendship Center, give it to the Native Women's Shelter, and so on and so forth. I'm okay. But we look at those events and seeing how we can do things. And of course, the most important thing, and I think you have to do this overtly, is denounce racism. Okay, racism is the most insidious thing because it attacks the people, then it moves to attacking the person, okay? And then, at the very end of the day, and what you do is associate them. You know what? You're running on Indian time, let me understand that. Oh, I heard you, you Indigenous people, if a woman, and this, so I'm not making this stuff up, if a man blows the match in front of you, that means that you want to sleep with them. So poor Julie had children, teenagers blowing matches out in front of her, everything else, like when she put a ward on her sleeves. And then my first contact of being racism was wearing my indigeneity on my sleeves in a professional working environment. So whenever you see that racism, denounce it, call it out for what it is, bring it into the light. Finally, I think, finally, one of the things I want to leave you with is children always get it right. So there was this contest that was being held actually as part of the reconciliation, and it was really wonderful. And this one kind of struck me the most, and said, just reach out, have a conversation at the very end of the day. Don't worry about the being ignorant or anything like that. And finally, I want to leave you with what Mary Sinclair said, Justice Mary Sinclair said. He said, education is what got us here. Education is what's going to get us out of here. So with that, I leave you with my talk of the day. So thank you so much for listening to me.